Court opinions that you will be applying interpret enacted law, common law, or both. How do you apply such opinions? Assume that you are in the law library, researching the facts presented by a client, or by your teacher, in a school assignment. We will refer to these facts as the problem facts. You are looking for court opinions that might apply to the problem facts. When you find an opinion that looks promising, you carefully study and brief it. See Exhibit 7.2. You identify its holdings, the answers of the court to the legal issues before it. You now want to know whether any of the holdings applies to the problem facts. To answer this question, you need to go through two separate comparisons. Rule comparison. First, you compare the rule enacted law, or common law, that was interpreted and applied in the opinion with the rule that you have uncovered elsewhere in your research, or the rule that you have been given as potentially applicable to your problem facts. Fact comparison. Second, you compare the key facts of the opinion, i.e., those that were essential or very important to the holding, with your problem facts. Let's look at these comparisons in greater detail. Rule comparison. Suppose your client, in the problem facts, is charged with a violation of 23b of the state code on the payment of certain taxes. One of your first steps is to go to the law library and find 23b. You want to know whether 23b applies to your client. After a preliminary analysis of this statute on your own, you search for court opinions that interpreted and applied 23b. You would not try to find opinions that interpreted housing or pollution statutes. You focus on opinions that cover the same rule involved in the case of the client, here 23b. This is also true of the common law. If the client has a negligence case, for example, you search for opinions that interpret the law of negligence. Rule comparison in the analysis of opinions, therefore, is fairly simple. The general principle is as follows. You compare the rule involved in your client's case or school assignment with the rule interpreted and applied in the opinion, and you proceed only if the rule is exactly the same. Although there are some exceptions, this principle will be sufficient to guide you most of the time. Fact comparison here is the heart of the analysis. Before the holding of an opinion can apply, you must demonstrate that the key facts of the opinion are substantially the same as the problem facts. If the facts are exactly the same, or almost exactly the same, the opinion is said to be on all fours with your facts. If so, then you will have little difficulty convincing some on all fours exactly the one that the holding of the opinion applies to your facts. It is rare, however, that you will same, or almost so, find an opinion on all fours. Consequently, careful analysis factual similarities and differences must be made. In general, if the facts are substantially similar, the ruling applies. If they are substantially different, it does not. You must identify the key facts in the opinion because these facts alone are the basis of the comparison. As we saw when we studied the brief of an opinion, a key fact is one that was very important or crucial to the holding or conclusion reached by the court. In a divorce opinion, for example, it will probably not be key that a plaintiff was 33 years old. The court would have reached the same result if the plaintiff was 32 or 34. Age may have been irrelevant or of very minor importance to the holding. What may have been key is that the plaintiff beat his wife, because without this fact the court might not have reached the conclusion holding that the ground of cruelty existed. You carefully comb the opinion to read what the judge said about the various facts. Did the court emphasize certain facts, repeat them, label them as crucial or important? These are the kinds of questions you must ask yourself to determine which facts in the opinion were key. See facts in Exhibit 7.2 earlier in the chapter. L/IILE skills of a paralegal. Let us assume you have been able to identify the key facts of the opinion. Your next concern is comparing these facts and the facts of your own problem. For example, your facts client sees an ad in the paper on a sale at a local store. He goes to the back of the store and falls into a pit. There was a little sign that said danger near the pit. The client wants to sue the store owner, J. Jackson, for negligence in failing to use reasonable care in preventing his injury. The law office assigns a paralegal to research the case. The paralegal finds the case of Smith v. Apex Co. and wants to argue that it applies. The opinion, Smith v. Apex Co. This case involved a man Tom Smith who is looking for an address. He is walking down the street. He decides to walk into an office building to ask someone for directions. While coming down the corridor, he slips and falls on a wet floor. There was a small sign in the corridor that said wet floor, which Smith saw. Smith sued the owner of the building Apex Co. for negligence. The court held that the owner was negligent for failure to exercise reasonable care for the safety of users of the building. The site of the opinion is Smith v. Apex Co. 223 Mass 578 78 N.E.2D422-1980. First, identify all factual similarities. The client was in a public place, a store. Smith was also in a public place, an office building. Both situations involved some kind of warning, the danger sign and the wet floor sign. The warning in both situations was not conspicuous. The danger sign was little. The wet floor sign was small. Next, identify all factual differences. The client was in a store, whereas Smith was in an office building. The client's case involved a hole or pit, whereas Smith v. Apex Co. involved a slippery surface. The client was there about a possible purchase, whereas Smith was looking for directions, and therefore not trying to transact any business in the office building. Next, identify any factual gaps. Smith saw the wet floor sign, but we do not know whether the client saw the danger sign. 90% of your legal analysis is complete if you have been able to make these three categories of fact identification: factual similarities, factual differences, and factual gaps. Many students either ignore the categories or do a superficial job of laying them out. They do not carefully pick apart the facts in order to identify similarities, differences, and gaps. Once you have done this properly, you make your final arguments about the opinion. If you want the holding in the opinion to apply, you emphasize the similarities between your facts and the key facts in the opinion. If any of your facts differ from a fact in the opinion, you try to point out that this is not significant, because the latter was not a key fact in the opinion. If you do not want the holding in the opinion to apply, you emphasize the differences between your facts and the key facts in the opinion. If any of your facts is similar to a fact in the opinion, you try to point out that this is not significant, because there is still a dissimilarity with at least one of the key facts in the opinion. Factual gaps sometimes pose a problem. If the factual gap is in the facts of your client's case, you simply go back to the client and ask him or her about the fact. In our negligence example, the paralegal asks the client whether he saw the danger sign. Suppose, however, that the factual gap is in the opinion itself. Assume that your client was running when he fell into the pit, but that the opinion does not sell. You Wecker Smith was running walk. Ingek. You obviously cannot go co-Smith or co-Che judge who wrote Che opinion and ask. You must make a guess of what the judge would have done in the opinion if Smith was running at the time he slipped on the corridor floor. You may decide that it would have changed the result, or that this additional fact would have made no difference to the holding of the court. We turn now to an overview of how Smith v. Apex Co. would be applied to the client's case in a memorandum of law. The latter, as we have seen, is simply a written analysis or explanation of how the law might apply to a fact situation. In Chapter 12, we will discuss the components of a memorandum of law in greater detail. For now, we concentrate on only three components: legal issue, facts, and analysis. The client's case and the Smith opinion involve exactly the same rule, the law of negligence. Assume that the part of this rule that is in contention, the element in contention between the client and the store owner. Jackson is the requirement that reasonable care be used. Legal issue. Did the store use reasonable care for the safety of users of the store when the only warning of a pit in the store was a small danger sign near the pit? Facts. The client saw an ad in the newspaper announcing a sale. He went to the back of the store and fell into a pit. There was a small sign that said danger near the pit. Analysts. An opinion on point is Smith v. Apex Co. 233 Mass 578 78 N.E.2D422-1980. In this opinion, the holding of the court was that the owner of an office building was liable for negligence when Smith slipped on a wet corridor floor in the building. There was a small wet floor sign in the corridor. This opinion is substantially similar to our own client's case. Both were in public buildings, where owners can expect people to be present. In both situations, the warning was insufficient. The wet floor sign, in the opinion, was small. The danger sign in our situation was little. Because of all these important similarities, it can be argued that the holding in Smith v. Apexco applies. It is true that in the opinion, the judge pointed out that Smith saw the sign. Our facts do not state whether the client saw the danger sign in the store. This, however, should not make any difference. The judge in the opinion would probably have reached the same holding if Smith had not seen the wet floor sign. In fact, the case would probably have been stronger for Smith if he did not see the sign. The building was dangerous, in spite of the fact that users of the building such as Smith could see the sign. Obviously, the danger would be considered even greater if such users could not see the sign. We should find out from our client whether he saw the danger sign, but I do not think that it will make any difference in the applicability of the holding in Smith v. Apexco. The store owner will try to argue that the opinion does not apply. The argument might be that a pit is not as dangerous as a wet floor, because a pit is more conspicuous than a wet floor, and hence not as hazardous. A user is more likely to notice a hole in the floor than to know whether a floor is slippery enough to fall on. Our client could respond by pointing out that the pit was in the back of the store, where it may not have been very noticeable. Furthermore, the wet floor, in the opinion, was apparently conspicuous. Smith saw the wet floor sign, yet in the opinion, the judge still found the defendant liable. Assignment 7.7. In the following situations, point out any factual similarities, differences, and gaps between the client facts and the facts of the opinion. A client facts, /M is driving his car, 30 mph, on a dirt road at night. He suddenly sneezes and jerks the steering wheel, slightly causing the car to move to the right and run into Bill's fence. Bill sues him for negligence. Opinion. A pedestrian brings a negligence action against Mary. Mary is driving her motorcycle on a clear day. A page of a newspaper unexpectedly flies into Mary's face. Because she cannot see where she is going, she runs into a pedestrian crossing the street. The court finds for Mary, ruling that she did not act unreasonably in causing the accident. B. Client facts. Helen is the mother of David, age 4. The state is trying to take David away from Helen, on the ground that Helen has neglected David. Helen lives alone with David. She works part-time, and leaves David with a neighbor. L/UL. Skills of a paralegal. Helen's job occasionally requires her to travel. Once she was away for a month. During this period, David was sometimes left alone because the neighbor had to spend several days at the hospital. When David was discovered alone, the state began proceedings to remove David from Helen on the ground of neglect. Opinion. The state charged Bob Thompson with the neglect of his twins, aged 10. The state wishes to place the twins in a foster home. Bob is partially blind. One day he accidentally tripped and fell on one of the twins, causing severe injuries to the child. Bob lives alone with the twins, but refuses to hire anyone to help him run the home. The court ruled that Bob did not neglect his children. Finally, we need to relate IROC to our discussion of applying opinions. IROC, covered at the beginning of the chapter, is an acronym for the structure of legal analysis, issue, rule, application, sometimes called analysis and conclusion. We said that, when you are analyzing any rule such as a statute, you break it down into its elements, create issues out of the elements in contention, and connect the facts to those elements. We also said that if you found any court opinions in your research, you would include them in your analysis. Opinions are examined in the A component of IROC. That is what we did in the example of the client who fell into a pit and sued the store owner for negligence. The element in contention was reasonable care, which became the basis of this issue. Did the store use reasonable care for the safety of users of the store when the only warning of a pit in the store was a small danger sign near the pit? To help answer this question, we applied Smith v. Apexco through the comparisons we have outlined. If other opinions were potentially relevant, they would have to be argued in the same manner. Assignment 7.8a. Before Helen became a paralegal for the firm of Harris & Dirksen, she was a chemist for a large corporation. Harris & Dirksen is a patent law firm where Helen's technical expertise in chemistry is invaluable. Helen's next-door neighbor is an inventor. On a number of occasions, he discussed the chemical makeup of his inventions with Helen. The neighbor is being charged by the government with stealing official secrets in order to prepare one of these inventions. Harris & Dirksen represents the neighbor on this case. Helen also works directly on the case for the firm. In a prosecution of the neighbor, Helen is called as a witness and is asked to reveal the substance of all her conversations with the neighbor concerning the invention in question. Does Helen have to answer? Apply United States v. Koval to this question. Do not do any legal research. Limit yourself to the application of this one opinion, based on the guidelines of this section. For the text of Koval, see page 320b. Salem is a factory town of 500 inhabitants in Hawaii. The factory employs 95% of the workers in the town. The town has only 2 private attorneys, Ann Grote and Timothy Farrell. 40 of the employees have decided to sue the factory over a wage dispute. Ann Grote represents all these employees. She works alone except for her only employee, Bob Davis, a paralegal. In this litigation, the factory is represented by Timothy Farrell, who has no employees, no secretaries and no paralegals. Grote and Farrell are young attorneys, who have just begun their practices. Their only clients are the 40 employees, and the factory, respectively. The litigation has become quite complicated. Several months before the case is scheduled to go to trial, Farrell offers Davis a job as a paralegal at double the salary he is earning with Grote. Davis accepts the offer. Grote goes to court seeking a preliminary injunction against Davis and Farrell, which would bar them from entering this employment relationship. Apply Quinn v. Lum and Cronin, Fried Salihu & Kekina, to the facts of the case of Grote v. Davis and Farrell. Do not do any legal research. Limit yourself to the application of this one opinion, based on the guidelines of this section. For the text of Quinn, see page 323. C. Anthony Bay is a paralegal who works for Iverson, Kelly, and Winters in Philadelphia. He is an at-will employee. His supervising attorney is Grace Swenson. One day Bay notices that Swenson deposited a client settlement check in the General Earl law firm account. Bay calls the Bar Association Disciplinary Committee and charges Swenson with commingling funds unethically. Attorneys have an ethical obligation to keep client funds and general law firm funds in separate accounts. Commingling or mixing these funds in one account is unethical, as we saw in Chapter 5. Bay is fired for disloyalty. In the meantime, the bar investigates the charge of commingling and finds that the charge is accurate. Swenson is eventually disciplined. Can Bay sue Swenson and Iverson, Kelly, and Winters for wrongful dismissal? Apply Brown v. Hammond to answer this question. Do not do any legal research. Limit yourself to the application of this one opinion, based on the guidelines of this section. For the text of Brown, see page 228. ICHL_PTERSU_L_UR. Legal analysis is the process of connecting a rule of law to a set of facts in order to answer a legal question or issue for the purpose of avoiding or resolving a legal dispute or preventing it from becoming worse. IROC presents the structure of legal analysis. Issue a question that arises out of the facts of the problem, rule the statute, common law, or other rule that is being applied, application the connection of the facts to the rule, and conclusion a statement of which side has the better argument of how the rule applies to the facts. An important skill in legal analysis is the ability to break a rule down into its elements. An element is simply a component or portion of a rule that is a precondition of the applicability of the entire rule. If all the elements apply to a fact situation, then the rule applies to the fact situation. If any one element does not apply, then the rule does not apply. A legal issue is often phrased to ask whether one of the elements applies to the facts. This element is referred to as the element in contention. The answer may depend on whether the element is to be interpreted broadly or narrowly. Sometimes the applicability of a rule or an element within a rule will be determined by an assessment of factors. A factor is one of the circumstances or considerations that will be weighed, no one of which is usually conclusive. To brief an opinion means to identify its 10 major components: citation parties, objectives of the parties, theories of the litigation, history of the litigation, facts issues, holdings reasoning, and disposition. In addition, it is often essential to determine the subsequent history of the opinion. A thumbnail brief is a shorthand brief of an opinion, consisting of the citation, facts issues, holdings reasoning, and disposition. Opinions interpret enacted law, common law, or both kinds of law. There are two main steps in applying an opinion to a set of facts from a client's case. First, you compare the rule, which will be either an enacted law or a common law that was interpreted in the opinion, with the rule you are considering in the client's case. With limited exceptions, the opinion cannot apply unless these two rules are the same. Second, you compare the key facts in the opinion with the facts of the client's case. In general, the opinion will apply if these facts are the same or are substantially similar. Key terms: legal analysis, legal issue, application factor, IROC brief, memorandum of law, trial brief, element, appellate brief, element in contention, unofficial reporter. 330p.IITIK skills of a paralegal: citation, holding, appellant, disposition, respondent, remand, reported dictum, syllabus, majority opinion, headnote, concurring opinion, key number, dissenting opinion, digest, analogous, key fact, enacted law, precedent, prospective stare, decisis, common law reasoning, on all fours on the net. More on legal analysis. How to brief a case: www.casanotes.com/HOW, 2BRFHTML, www.classes.washburnlaw.edu/last/lawschlusks00, HTM, www.law.umpt.edu/faculty/profiles/glessnerfind/bateman.htm, IROC, www.lawschool.lexis.com/writing/IROC, legal analysis. On examinations: www.lawschool.lexis.com/exams/ttttlawschool.westlaw.com/student-center/writing-exam.asp. APPFLAG equal 16% 2E 5% SITE PH www.gilbertlaw.com/student/survival_writing.asp. Chapter 8 Legal Interviewing Reary Chapter Outline A Client Relations. In an era of lawyer bashing, be hiring the firm. C. The context of interviewing in litigation. D. The format of an intake memo. E. What facts do you seek? Guides to the formulation of questions. F. What does the client want? G. Assessing your own biases. H. Communication skills. Left bracket Silian /GII/T Ruvenans. In an era of lavater Basfung, before beginning our study of interviewing, we need to examine some preliminary matters that often influence client relationships today. You may be working with many clients who are hiring an attorney for the first time. Their image of the legal profession is often heavily influenced by the portrayal of attorneys in the media. Lately, the media have been very negative about attorneys. In a steady stream of commercials, cartoons, and jokes, attorneys have been held up to public ridicule. Indeed, there has been so much unfavorable publicity that many bar associations have accused the media of lawyer bashing and have urged their members to take affirmative steps to improve the image of the profession. This may be the environment in which a paralegal comes into contact with clients. How they perceive you matters a great deal. The way you dress, how you communicate, and how you perform your job can reinforce the negativism or help reverse it. Whether you are interviewing the client or have roles that require no client contact, it is extremely important that you project yourself as a professional. There is no better way to combat negative stereotypes of attorneys than for everyone in the office to maintain a high level of integrity and competence. You should act on the assumption that every large or small task you perform on a client's case is of critical importance. Even if you have only a small role in a particular client's case, you should assume that how you perform your role will help determine whether the client is satisfied with the services rendered by the entire office, and whether he or she will Readily recommend the office to relatives, friends, and business associates. This is particularly important because about 40% of a law office's new business comes from referrals and recommendations of satisfied clients. Admittedly, you cannot single-handedly correct the public's perception of attorneys. It is due to forces beyond your control. Attorneys sometimes take unpopular cases such as defending people charged with committing heinous crimes. When interviewed on TV or radio, these attorneys seldom generate much sympathy when they suggest that the accused is the victim. Attorneys are frequently injected into the middle of bitter disputes, where they become lightning rods for underlying and overt hostility. Opponents often accuse the other attorney of causing the hostility, or of setting up roadblocks to resolution, in order to increase fees. Although you cannot eliminate these perceptions, you can perform your job in such a way that the client feels that his or her case is the most important case you are working on, and that you are doing everything possible to help the office keep costs to a minimum. This kind of professionalism will be a significant step in the direction of correcting public misconceptions about the practice of law. Retainer 1. A contract between an attorney and a client that covers the scope of services, fees, expenses, and costs of legal services. 2. An amount of money or other property paid by a client as a deposit or advance against future fees, expenses, and costs of legal services. Deep pocket: an individual who has resources with which to pay a potential judgment, the opposite of a shallow pocket. Section B. Hiring the firm. Once the prospective client decides to hire the firm, and the firm agrees to provide representation, their relationship should be formalized in a contract called the retainer. It covers the scope of services, fees, expenses, and costs of the legal services to be provided. See Exhibit 8.1. The word retainer also refers to an amount of money or other property paid by the client as a deposit or advance against future attorney fees, expenses such as travel, and costs such as court filing fees. Suppose, however, the attorney decides not to accept the case. This may happen for a number of different reasons. There may be a conflict of interest, because the law office once represented the opponent of the prospective client. See Chapter 5. The attorney may feel that the case lacks merit, because there is no legal justification for what the client wants to accomplish. More commonly, the attorney will refuse to take the case for economic reasons. The client may not be able to afford the anticipated legal fees, and the part the client wants to sue may not have enough cash or other resources to pay a winning judgment. Such an opponent is said to lack a deep pocket. Whatever the reason, it is very important for the sample retainer agreement. Attorney-client fee contract. This attorney-client fee contract is entered into by and between client and attorney. 1. Conditions. This contract will not take effect, and attorney will have no obligation to provide legal services until client returns a signed copy of this contract and pays the deposit called for under paragraph 3. 2. Scope and duties. Client hires attorney to provide legal services. In connection with, attorney shall provide those legal services reasonably required to represent client, and shall take reasonable steps to keep client informed of progress and to respond to client's inquiries. Client shall be truthful with attorney, cooperate with attorney, keep attorney informed of developments, abide by this contract, pay attorney's bills on time, and keep attorney advised of client's address, telephone number, and whereabouts. 3. Deposit. Client shall deposit $by. The sum will be deposited in a trust account to be used to pay costs and expenses only. Costs and expenses and fees for legal services. Client hereby authorizes attorney to withdraw sums from the trust account to pay the costs or fees, or both, that client incurs. Any unused deposit at the conclusion of attorney services will be refunded for legal fees. Client agrees to pay for legal services at the following rates: partners $NR, associates $NR, paralegals $NR, law clerks $_NR, and for other personnel as follows. If services to client require extensive word processing work for documents in excess of 5 pages, client will be charged $1 a page. Attorneys and paralegals charge in minimum units of 0.2 hours. 5. Costs and expenses. In addition to paying legal fees, client shall reimburse attorney for all costs and expenses incurred by attorney, including, but not limited to process servers' fees, fees fixed by law or assessed by courts or other agencies court. Reporters' fees, long-distance telephone calls, messenger and other delivery fees, postage, in-office photocopying at $, a page parking, mileage at $, a mile, investigation expenses, consultants' fees, expert witness fees, and other similar items. Client authorizes attorney to incur all reasonable costs and to hire any investigators, consultants, or expert witnesses reasonably necessary, in attorney's judgment, unless one or both of the clauses below are initialed by client and attorney. Attorney shall obtain client's consent before incurring any cost in excess of $. Attorney shall obtain client's consent before retaining outside investigators, consultants, or expert witnesses. 6. Statements. Attorney shall send client periodic statements for fees and costs incurred. Client shall pay attorney's statements within days after each statement's date. Client may request a statement at intervals of no less than 30 days. Upon client's request, attorney will provide a statement within 1 day. 7. Lien. Client hereby grants attorney a lien on any and all claims or causes of action that are the subject of attorney's representation under this contract. Attorney's lien will be for any sums due and owing to attorney at the conclusion of attorney's services. The lien will attach to any recovery client may obtain, whether by arbitration award, judgment settlement, or other means. 8. Discharge and withdrawal. Client may discharge attorney at any time. Attorney may withdraw with client's consent, or for good cause. Good cause includes client's breach of this contract, client's refusal to cooperate with attorney, or to follow attorney's advice on a material matter, or any other fact or circumstance that would render attorney's continuing representation unlawful or unethical. Note that paragraph 2 is careful to state that reasonable steps will be taken. The attorney's standard of performance will be reasonableness. The office's obligation is to do what is reasonable, not to guarantee any specific results. This disclaimer is made more explicit in paragraph 10. Paragraph 4 makes clear that fees for paralegal services are separate and additional to fees charged by attorneys and law clerks. The latter are individuals who are still in law school or who have completed law school and are awaiting bar examination results. Exhibit 8.1 Sample Retainer Agreement. Continued JL. Note that paragraph 9 does not say that the client cannot have his or her file back until all fees are paid. Such a condition would be unethical. See Chapter 5(9). Conclusion of services. When attorney's services conclude, all unpaid charges shall become immediately due and payable. After attorney's services conclude, attorney will, upon client's request, deliver client's file to client, along with any client funds or property in attorney's possession. 10. DISCL 7 MMER of guarantee. Nothing in this contract and nothing in attorney's statements to client will be construed as a promise or guarantee about the outcome of client's matter. Attorney makes no such promises or guarantees. Attorney's comments about the outcome of client's matter are expressions of opinion only. 11. Effective date. This contract will take effect when client has performed the conditions stated in paragraph 1, but its effective date will be retroactive to the date attorney first provided services. The date at the beginning of this contract is for reference only. Even if this contract does not take effect, client will be obligated to pay attorney the reasonable value of any services attorney may have performed for client. Attorney by client source, Pamela / Everett, Fundamentals of Law Office Management, 196-7 1994. Letter of non-engagement. A letter sent to a prospective client that explicitly says that the law office will not be representing him or her. Office to document its rejection of a prospective client by sending him or her a letter explicitly stating that the office will not be representing him or her. The document is called a letter of non-engagement. Its purpose is to avoid any misunderstandings if the person later claims to have been confused about whether the office had agreed to take the case. This person may try to assert that he or she took no further action on the case because of the belief that the office was going to provide representation. The ultimate nightmare occurs when this person loses the case by default because no one showed up in court at a scheduled hearing. One way to avoid this predicament is by sending him or her an emphatic letter of non-engagement, sometimes humorously referred to in the office as the Dear Not Client letter. The letter will often conclude with a statement such as the following: while our office cannot represent you, we urge you to protect your rights by seeking other counsel. Section C. The context of interviewing. In litigation, there are three main kinds of legal interviews: the initial client interview, the follow-up client interview, the investigation field interview of someone other than the client. In the initial client interview, the attorney-client relationship is established, and legal problems are identified as the fact collection process begins. Follow-up interviews occur after the initial interview. The client is asked about additional facts and is consulted on a variety of matters that require his or her attention, consent, and participation. The field interview is conducted during investigation. The interviewer, as investigator, will contact individuals outside the office in order to try to verify facts already known and to uncover new relevant facts. Investigation will be examined in the next chapter. Here our focus will be the initial client interview. Interviewing is among the most important skills used in a law office. Many assume that this skill is relatively easy to perform. All you need is a person to interview. The interviewing in the context of litigation negotiations for settlement field investigation, initial client interview a pleasing personality and some time. Yet interviewing is much more than good conversation. To avoid incomplete and sloppy interviewing, the interviewer must establish a relationship with the client that is warm, trusting, professional, and goal-oriented. The focus of everything done in a law office, including the legal interview, is to identify legal problems and to help the client solve them. Paralegals in different settings have varied duties and authority. In a private law office, an attorney will usually conduct the initial interview and may assign the paralegal the task of gathering detailed information from the client on a specific topic. For example, a paralegal may be asked to help a bankruptcy client obtain details on debts and assets by listing them all on a worksheet. On the other hand, in a government agency or in a government-funded legal service office, the paralegal's interviewing responsibilities can be extensive. For example, a paralegal might conduct the initial interview with a client and remain the primary office contact for the client throughout the resolution of the case. The initial client interview is critical because it sets the foundation for the entire litigation process. See Exhibit 8.2. The facts obtained from this interview are further pursued through field investigation. Subsequent or follow-up client interviews are often needed to clarify new facts and pursue leads uncovered during investigation. The laws governing the facts are researched in the law library. The facts and the governing law are informally argued between counsel for the parties in an effort to settle the case through negotiation. If there is no settlement, a trial is held in which the facts are formally established. Finally, the process may end with an appeal. Everything begins with the facts obtained through the initial client interview. A poor job done at this stage can have major negative consequences throughout the remaining steps of the litigation process. Section D. The 4E of an intake memo. Before analyzing the interviewing process, we should look briefly at one of the end products of the interview, a document that is sometimes called the intake memo. It summarizes the interviewer's notes on the interview. The intake memo goes first to the supervisor and then into a newly opened case file on the client. The memo often has 5 parts. Intake memo, a memorandum that summarizes the facts given by a client during the initial client interview. TILE skills /UU/L-Ray concerning in Ray in the title of a court opinion means in the matter of. See Chapter 111. Heading. The heading provides the following information at the top of the first page. The name of the person who wrote the memo, the supervisor in charge of the case to whom the memo is addressed, the date the memo was written, the date the interview was conducted, the name of the case, the office file number of the case, the kind of case, general area of the law, the notation Ray, which means concerning or in reference to. After A, you state the general subject matter of the memo. 2. Personal data name of the client, home address, phone numbers, where the client can be reached, email address, age of client, marital status, place of employment of the client, etc. 3. Statement of the assignment. The first paragraph of the memo should state the precise objective the paralegal was given in conducting the interview. It is a more detailed statement of what was listed under A in the heading. 4. Body of the memo. Here the facts are presented in a coherent, readable manner according to a number of possible organizational principles. A chronological listing of the facts so that the events are unfolded as a story, with a beginning, middle, and end. A categorizing of the facts according to the major topics or issues of the case, e.g. background, accident, causation, medical expenses, each with its own subject heading under which the relevant facts are placed. Any other format called for by the supervisor. 5. Conclusion. Here a number of things could be included. A brief summary of the major facts listed in the body of the memo, the paralegal's impressions of the client, such as how knowledgeable the client appeared to be, how believable the client appeared to be, a list of the next steps, for example. What further facts should be sought through investigation, what legal research should be undertaken, any other recommendations on what should be done on the case based on what was learned during the interview, a list of anything the paralegal told the client to do, for example. Bring in specified documents relevant to the case. Check on further facts and call back return for another interview. Exhibit 8.3 shows a sample of the introductory parts of an intake memo. Ground a reason that is legally sufficient to obtain a remedy or other result. Section E. What facts do you seek? Guides to the formulation of questions. Unless the paralegal knows what to accomplish in an interview, valuable time will be wasted. For example, suppose a client is being interviewed concerning the grounds for a divorce. The paralegal does not simply write down all the facts about the marriage and the client's problems in it. The facts must be clustered or arranged in categories that are relevant to grounds for divorce. Unless the paralegal has this objective in mind before and during the interview, he or she may end up with a confusing collection of facts and may. Exhibit 8.3 Intake Memo. Beginning of an intake memo to N. Fuller, Supervisor Case, John Myers vs. Betsy Myers FROMJIM Smith, Paralegal File Number 01-102. Date of memo, March 13, 2001. Kind of case, child custody. Date of interview, March 12, 2001. Ray. Intake interview of John Myers. Personal data name of CLIENTJOHN Myers. Address, 34 Main Street, Salem, Massachusetts 01970. Phone, 966-3954H, 297-9700X301, W. Email, jmyers@ol.com. Age, 37. Marital status, married but separated from his wife, Betsy Myers. Employment, ABC Construction Co., 2064 South Street, Salem, Massachusetts 02127. You asked me to conduct a comprehensive intake interview of John Myers, our client, in order to obtain a listing of his assets and the facts surrounding his relationship with his children. Assets John Myers owns. Have to conduct a second interview to go over matters that should have been covered entirely. As all-star Yankee catcher Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you are going, when you get there you'll be lost. This does not mean that the paralegal cannot talk about anything other than what is directly related to the objective, but it does mean that each interview must have a definite /BCI. There are 6 major ways to achieve focus in the formulation of questions to be asked of a client. Instructions of the supervisor for the interview, checklists, legal analysis, fact, particularization, common sense, flexibility. Their methods are designed to help you avoid all the following examples of an ineffective interview. You fail to seek the information that the supervisor wanted you to obtain. You miss major relevant facts. You fail to obtain sufficient detail on the major relevant facts. You fail to ask questions about the extent to which the client was sure or unsure about the major facts the client gives you. You fail to pursue leads the client provides about other relevant themes or topics that may not have been part of the supervisor's explicit instructions, or may not have been within the scope of your initial questions. Instructions of the supervisor for the interview. The instructions of the supervisor control what you do in the interview. You may be asked to do a limited interview, or a comprehensive one. Be sure to write down what the supervisor wants from the interview. One concern that frequently arises is the amount of detail desired. Attorneys like facts. During 3 years of law school, they were constantly asked by their law professors, what are the facts? The likelihood is that the attorney for whom you work will want considerable detail from the interview. Even if you are told to limit yourself to obtaining the basic facts from the client, you may find that the supervi. Legal analysis, the application of one or more rules to the facts of a client's case in order to answer a legal question that will help 1. Keep a legal dispute from arising, 2. Resolve a legal dispute that has arisen, or 3. Prevent a legal dispute from becoming worse. Legally relevant, contributing to the resolution of a legal problem or issue, or wants a lot of detail about those basic facts. When in doubt, the safest course is to be detailed in your questioning. If possible, try to sit in on an interview conducted by your supervisor to observe his or her method of questioning and the amount of detail sought. Also examine some closed or open case files that contain intake memos. Ask the supervisor if any of these memos is exemplary, and if so, why. Once you have a model, it can be very useful as a guide. Checklists. The office where you work may have checklists that are used in conducting interviews. For some kinds of cases, such as probate or bankruptcy, the checklists may be extensive. If such checklists are not available, you should consider writing your own for the kinds of cases in which you acquire experience. Caution is needed in using checklists. You should find out why individual questions were inserted in the checklist. You should be flexible enough to ask relevant questions that may not be on the checklist. By definition, a checklist is nothing more than a standard form. Use it as a guide that must be adapted to the case and client in front of you, rather than as a rigid formula from which there can be no deviation. See Exhibit 10.11 on how to avoid abusing a standard form in Chapter 10. Legal analysis. Extensive legal analysis does not take place while the interview is being conducted. Yet certain legal analysis may be needed to conduct an intelligent interview. See Chapter 7 for an overview of legal analysis. Most of the questions you ask in the interview should be legally relevant, or be reasonably likely to lead to something that is legally relevant. As we will see in Chapter 10, this is the standard of permissible questions that can be asked during pretrial discovery. A question is legally relevant if the office needs the answer to determine whether a particular legal principle governs. At least a general understanding of legal analysis is needed to be able to apply the concept of legal relevance intelligently. It could be dangerous for the paralegal to be asking questions by rote, even if checklists are used. The question and answer process is a little like a tennis match. You go where the ball is hit or it passes you by. Suppose that you are interviewing a client on an unemployment compensation claim. The state denied the claim because the client is allegedly not available for work as required by statute. You cannot conduct a competent interview unless you know the legal meaning of this phrase. From this understanding, you can formulate questions that are legally relevant to the issue of whether the client has been and is available for work. You will ask obvious questions such as, where have you applied for work? Were you turned down, and if so, why? Did you turn down any work, and if so, why? What is your present health? Suppose that during the interview, the client tells you the following. There were some ads in the paper for jobs in the next town, but I didn't want to travel that far. You must decide whether to pursue this matter by inquiring about the distance to the town, whether public transportation is available, the cost of such transportation, whether the client owns a car, etc. Again, legal analysis can be helpful. What did the legislature mean by the phrase available for work? As we saw in Chapter 7, one of the central questions asked in legal analysis is how broadly or narrowly legal terms can be defined. Does available for work mean available anywhere in the county or state broad, or does it mean available within walking distance or by easily accessible public transportation narrow? Is one unavailable for work because of a refusal to make efforts to travel to an otherwise available job in another area? Questions such as these must go through your mind as you decide whether to seek more details about the ads for work in the other town. These are questions of legal analysis. You must be thinking while questioning. Some instant mental analysis should be going on all the time. This does not mean you must know the answer to every legal question that comes to mind while interviewing the client. But you must know something about the law and must be flexible enough to think about questions that should be generated by unexpected facts provided by the client. When in doubt about whether to pursue a line of questions, check with your supervisor. If he or she is not available, the safest course is to pursue it. As you acquire additional interviewing experience in particular areas of the law, you will be better equipped to know what to do. Yet you will never know everything. There will always be fact situations that you have never encountered before. Legal analysis will help you handle such situations. Fact particularization. Fact particularization is one of the most important concepts in this book. To particularize a fact means to ask an extensive series of questions about that fact in order to explore its uniqueness. Fact assessment is critical to the practice of law. Fact particularization (FP) is critical to the identification of the facts that must be assessed. FP is a fact collection technique. It is the process of viewing every person, thing, or event as unique, different from every other person, thing, or event. Every important fact a client tells you in an interview should be particularized. You do this by asking a large number of follow-up questions once you have targeted the fact you want to explore. See Exhibit 8.4. Example. You are working on an automobile negligence case. Two cars collide on Aqua Lane Street. They were driven by Smith and Jones. Jones is a client of your law office. One of the facts alleged by Jones is that Smith's car veered into Jones's lane moments before the collision. Your job is to particularize this fact by trying to obtain a much more detailed picture of the alleged veering. This is done by seeking a comprehensive elaboration of this fact. Using FP, you ask the following common sense questions. Who, what, where, how, when, and why? What does Jones mean by veering into the other lane? How much veering was done? An inch? A foot? Did the entire car come into the other lane? How much of an angle was there? Who saw this happen? According to Jones, Smith's car veered. Did Jones see this happen himself? Who else saw it, if anyone? Any passengers in Jones's car? Any passengers in Smith's car? Were there any bystanders? Has the neighborhood been checked for witnesses, e.g. people who live or work in the area, people who frequently sit on public benches in the area? Were the police called after the accident? If so, who was the officer? Was a report made? If so, what does it say, if anything, about the car veering into the other lane? Where is this report? How can you obtain a copy? What time of day was it when it occurred? Why did Smith's car veer according to Jones or anyone else who alleges that this occurred? How fast was Jones's car going at the time of the veering? Why was Jones going at this speed? Who would be able to substantiate the speed? Who might have different views of how fast Jones was going? How fast was Smith's car going at the time of the veering? Why was Smith going at this speed? Who would be able to substantiate the speed? Who might have different views of how fast Smith was going? Have there been other accidents in the area? If so, how similar have they been to this one? Fact particularization, a fact-gathering technique used to generate a list of numerous factual questions that will help you obtain a specific and a comprehensive picture of all available facts that are relevant to a legal issue. Fact particularization (FP). You particularize a fact you already have. 1. By assuming that what you know about this fact is woefully inadequate. 2. By assuming that there is more than one version of this fact. And 3. By asking a large number of basic who, what, where, how, when, and why questions about the fact, which, if answered, will provide as specific and as comprehensive a picture of that fact as is possible at this time. What was the condition of the road at the time Smith started to veer? At the time of the collision? What was the weather at the time? How was visibility? What kind of a road is it? Straight, curved at the R off the collision? Any inclines, any hills that could affect speed and visibility. What kind of area is it? Residential, commercial. Is there anything in the area that would distract drivers, e.g., potholes? Where is the nearest traffic light, stop sign, or other traffic signal? Prepare a diagram. How, if at all, did they affect traffic at the time of the accident? What is the speed limit of the area? What kind of car was Smith driving? Were there any mechanical problems with the car? Would these problems help cause the VING? What prior accidents has Smith had, if any? What kind of car was Jones driving? Were there any mechanical problems with the car? What prior accidents has Jones had, if any? Etc. FP can be a guide in formulating factual questions that need to be asked in different settings. In a client interview, our focus in this chapter. In investigations, see Chapter 9. In interrogatories, written questions sent to an opponent prior to trial, see Exhibits 10.9 and 10.10 in Chapter 10. In a deposition and out-of-court session, in which questions are asked of an opponent or of a potential witness of the opponent prior to trial, see Exhibits 10.4 and 10.5 in Chapter 10. In an administrative or court hearing in which witnesses are formally questioned, see Chapters 10 and 15. In legal interviewing, the starting point for the FP process is an important fact that the client has told you during the interview. Here are additional examples. I tried to find work. The car hit me from the rear. The pain was unbearable. The company was falling apart. He told me I would get the ranch when he died. He fired me because I am a woman. Then you ask the client the basic who, what, where, how, when, and why questions that we used in the Smith and Jones driving example. As a guide to help you organize these questions, Exhibit 8.5 presents 8 categories of questions that need to be asked in order to achieve competent FP. Exhibit 8.5 Categories of questions for fact particularization FP. Fact particularization steps begin by obtaining a general picture of what happened. Next, particularize every important fact you obtain by seeking comprehensive details on that fact through questions that fall into the following categories: extent of certainty details on other participants' place and environment details, extent of uncertainty, the fact to be particularized, time details, analogies, miscellaneous details. The 8 categories are not mutually exclusive, and all 8 categories are not necessarily applicable to every fact that you will be particularizing. The questions need not be asked in any particular order, as long as you are comprehensive in your search for factual detail. The point of FP is simply to get the wheels of your mind rolling so that you will think of a large number of questions and avoid conducting a superficial interview. Time details: when did the fact occur or happen? Find out the precise date and time. The interviewer should be scrupulous about all dates and times. If more than one event is involved, ask questions about the dates and times of each. If the client is not sure, ask questions to help jog the memory, and ask the client to check his or her records, or to contact other individuals who might know. Do not be satisfied with an answer such as "it happened about 2 months ago." If this is what the client says, record it in your notes, but then probe further. Show the client a calendar and ask about other events going on at the same time, in an effort to help him or her be more precise. Place and environment details: be equally scrupulous about geography. Where did the event occur? Where was the thing or object in question? Where was the client at the time? Ask the client to describe the surroundings. Ask questions with such care that you obtain a verbal photograph of the scene. If relevant, ask the client to approximate distances between important objects or persons. You might want to have the client draw a diagram, or you can draw a diagram on the basis of what you are told, and ask the client if the drawing is accurate. Ask questions about the weather or about lighting conditions. You want to know as much as you can about the environment or whatever the client could observe about the environment through the senses of touch, sight, hearing, and smell. Details on other participants: who else was involved. Ask questions about who they were, their roles, their age, appearance, etc. if relevant. Where were they at the time? When did they act? Why did they act? Why did they fail to act? Could you have anticipated what they did or failed to do? Why or why not? Have they ever acted or failed to act in this way before? Ask questions designed to obtain a detailed picture of who these other participants were and their precise relationship to the fact being particularized. Extent of certainty/uncertainty. Everything the client tells you can be placed somewhere on the spectrum of certainty. Have absolutely, substantially, fairly, a vague, only a certain certainty, unsure guess. It would be a big mistake, for example, to record that the Chen said a letter was received 2 weeks ago, when in fact the client said, I think it came 2 weeks ago. Do not turn uncertainty into certainty by sloppy listening and sloppy recording in your intake memo of what the client said. Of course, it may be possible for a client to be uncertain about a fact initially, but then become more certain of it with the help of your questioning. If so, record this transition by saying the client at first did not remember who else was present, but then said she was fairly certain that Fred was there. At the outset, explain to the client how critical it is for you to obtain accurate information. Encourage the client to say, I'm not sure, when that is the case. Not everyone wants to make such admissions, particularly about facts that are favorable to what they are trying to accomplish. Clients must be relaxed and unthreatened before they will be this honest and frank about what they know, and more important, about what they do not know. A lot depends on the attitude of the interviewer in asking questions and in reacting to answers. Let the client know that, when you ask a question, you are looking for no more than analogy, a comparison of similarities and differences, the best of his or her recollection. Never be irritated or disappointed when a client cannot answer a question with absolute certainty. Do not keep saying, are you sure? After every client answer. Probing will often be necessary in order to find out where, on the spectrum of certainty, a fact falls. Yet this probing must be undertaken with tact and sensitivity. Verification details. The fact that the client tells you something happened is some evidence that it happened. Verification details are additional evidence that supports what the client has said. Always pursue verification details. Ask yourself how you would establish the truth of what the client has said if the client suddenly disappeared and you had to rely exclusively on other sources. Inquire about documents such as letters or check stubs that support the client's statements. Inquire about other people who might be available to testify to the same subject. Ask the client questions that will lead you to such verification details. This approach does not mean that you do not trust the client or that you think the client is lying. It is simply a good practice to view a fact from many perspectives. You are always seeking the strongest case possible. This calls for probing questions about verification details. Analogies. Some facts that you are particularizing, e.g., the pain was unbearable. I was careful. It looked awful. I was scared, are difficult to pin down. In the interview, you should ask the client to explain such statements. Sometimes it is helpful to ask the client to use analogies to describe what is meant. When you ask a client to use an analogy, you are simply asking him or her to explain something by comparing it to something else. For example, what would you compare it to? Was it similar to anything you have ever seen before? Have you observed anyone else do the same thing? Have you ever been in a similar situation? Did it feel like a dentist's drill? First you ask the client to compare the fact to something else. Then you ask about the similarities and differences. Through a series of directed questions, you are encouraging the client to analogize the fact he or she is describing to some other fact. This is done in a further attempt to obtain as comprehensive a picture as possible of what the client is saying. Miscellaneous details. Here, you simply ask about any details that were not covered in the previous categories of questions. Include questions on anything else that might help in particularizing the fact under examination. Class Exercise 8. A. In this exercise, FP will be role-played in class. One student will be selected to play the role of the client, and another, the role of the paralegal interviewer. The rest of the class will observe and fill out the FP scorecard on the interview. Instructions to interviewer. You will not be conducting a complete interview from beginning to end. You will be trying to particularize a certain fact that is given to you. Go through all the categories of FP outlined in Exhibit 8.5. Use any order of questioning you want. Probe for comprehensiveness. Your instructor will select one of the following facts to be used as the basis of the interview. I was hit in the jaw by Mary. B. He neglects his children. C. I have not been promoted because I am a woman. Your opening question to the client will be what happened. The client will make one of the three statements above. You then use the process of FP to particularize this statement. Instructions to client. The interviewer will ask you what happened. Simply make one of the three statements above as selected by the instructor. Then the interviewer will ask you a large number of questions about the statement. Make up the answers ad lib your responses. Do not, however, volunteer any information. Answer only the questions asked. Instructions to class. Observe the interview. Use the following scorecard to assess how well you think the interviewer particularized the fact. FP scorecard: precision in obtaining time details, precision in obtaining place and environment details, precision in obtaining details on other participants, precision in finding out where the client's statements fall on the spectrum of certainty, precision in seeking verification details, effectiveness in using analogies to obtain greater detail. Precision in obtaining miscellaneous details. 5 4 3 2 1 5 4 3 2 1 5 4 3 2 1 5 4 3 2 1 5 4 3 2 1 5 4 3 2 1. Sloppiness in obtaining time details, sloppiness in obtaining place and environment details, sloppiness in obtaining details on other participants. Sloppiness in finding out where the client's statements fall on the spectrum of certainty, sloppiness in seeking verification details, ineffectiveness in using analogies to obtain greater detail. J. Sloppiness in obtaining miscellaneous details. Following the interview, put a check on the appropriate number for each of the pressed. In categories of assessment. A 5 score means you thought the interview was very precise or effective in fulfilling the goal of FP. A 1 score means the opposite. Also make notes of questions you think the TERV/EWER should have asked. These questions and your scores will be discussed in class after the interview. Common sense. Common sense is another major guide to determining what questions to ask, achieving comprehensiveness, and giving the interview a focus. Though law is full of legalisms and technicalities, good judgment and common sense are still at the core of the practice of law. It is common sense, for example, to organize an interview by having the client tell the relevant events chronologically in the form of a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is common sense to follow up on a topic the client mentions with further questioning even though you had not anticipated the topic. If the client says something you do not understand, common sense dictates that you ask what the chant means before continuing with the interview. At times, it may be common sense to stop the interview for a moment to obtain further guidance from your supervisor. Flexibility. In the previous discussion, the importance of flexibility was mentioned a number of times. You must expect the unexpected, and you must be relaxed. Although you lead the interview and give it direction, you must be ready to go where the interview takes you. It would be potentially disastrous for you to block out topics that arise simply because they were not part of your game plan in conducting the interview or are not on your checklist. As with so many areas of the law, you may not know what you are looking for until you find it. In interviewing a client about incorporating a business, for example, you may stumble across a lead from something the client says that could involve fraud or criminal prosecution on a matter unrelated to the incorporation. Don't block this out. Pursue what appears to be reasonably related to the law office's relationship with the client. Check with your supervisor. Again, let common sense be your guide. Flexibility is one of the foundations of common sense. Section F. What does the client want? A number of points can be made about many clients, particularly new ones. They are not sure what they want. They change their minds about what they want. They are not aware of their legal and non-legal options. The legal problem they tell you about involves other legal problems that they are not aware of and that even you may not be aware of at the outset. Suppose a client walks into the office and says, "I want a divorce." The following observations might be possible about the client. 1. The client has an incorrect understanding of what a divorce is. 2. The client says she wants a divorce because she thinks this is the only legal remedy available to solve her problem. 3. If the client knew that other options existed, e.g., annulment, judicial separation, a restraining order, a support order, she would consider them. 4. What really troubles the client is that her husband beats the kids. A divorce is the only way she thinks she can stop it. 5. The client does not want a divorce. She is being pressured by her husband to institute divorce proceedings. He threatened her with violence if she refuses. 6. The client consciously or unconsciously wants and needs an opportunity to tell someone how badly the world is treating her, and if given this opportunity, she may not want to terminate the marriage. 7. If the client knew more about marriage or family counseling, she would consider using it before taking the drastic step of going to a law office for a divorce. If any of these observations is correct, think of how damaging it would be for someone in the law office to take out the standard divorce forms and quickly fill them out immediately after the client says, "I want a divorce." This response would not be appropriate without first probing beneath the statement to determine what in fact is on the client's mind. Some clients who speak only of divorces and separation agreements are receptive to and even anxious for reconciliation. The danger exists that the client might be steered in the direction of a divorce because no other options are presented to her, because no one takes the time to help her express the ideas, intentions, and desires that are lurking beneath the seemingly clear statement, "I want a divorce." This is not to say that you must psychoanalyze every chant or that you must always distrust what the chant tells you initially. It is rather a recognition of the fact that most people are confused about the law and make requests based on misinformation about what courses of action are available to solve problems.